Imagine a school that institutes, this new, incredibly popular policy.
Yeah.
Every time a student hits their monthly reading goal, they get a certificate for a free pizza.
I mean, I would have loved that as a kid.
Right. The kids are thrilled, parents are framing the certificates, and teachers are seeing this massive spike in library checkouts.
That's like a win-win.
On paper, yeah, it looks like a total triumph of the educational system. But structurally, like neurologically, it might actually be the most destructive thing you could possibly do for a child's long-term intellectual development.
Okay.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up the ultimate mental owner's manual for you. We're looking at the foundational concepts of psychology to understand the invisible machinery driving everything you do.
And honestly, it's a perfect scenario to start with because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about how human motivation actually works.
Right.
That pizza program is built on one of the oldest tenets of learning theory. It's called the law of effect.
The law of effect. Okay, what is that exactly?
Well, it posits this very simple mechanical relationship. When a reward follows a behavior, that behavior is strengthened.
Makes sense.
Yeah, you want a child to read. You reinforce the reading with a slice of pepperoni. And the data shows that in the short term, it absolutely works. Like the volume of reading genuinely goes up.
But there's a trapdoor there, right? Because, I mean, let's unpack this. It's kind of like if I took your favorite hobby, say, playing the guitar, and I started paying you $100 an hour to do it.
Right.
At first, you're thinking you hit the lottery, but eventually the neurochemistry of why you pick up the guitar shifts. You aren't playing for the joy of the music anymore.
Exactly. You're playing to get the $100.
Yeah. And if my funding dries up and the money stops, there's a very real chance you never touch that guitar again. We've effectively bought and destroyed your passion.
And that phenomenon is exactly what a group of researchers, led by David Green, set out to test in a classic 1976 experiment.
1976? Wow. So they knew about this a while ago.
Oh, yeah. They wanted to see if the law of effect had, dark side. So they went into elementary school classrooms and introduced a set of these novel, highly engaging math games.
Okay.
For the first 2 weeks, the researchers did absolutely nothing but observe. They needed a baseline.
So they just watched them play.
Just watched.
Yep.
They wanted to see how much time the kids would spend playing these games purely out of their own intrinsic curiosity.
No pressure, no grades, just kids being naturally drawn to a puzzle.
Exactly that. Then, during the 3rd week, they fundamentally altered the environment for half the kids.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. In the experimental classrooms, they started handing out these highly visible reward certificates and trophies just for playing the math games.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Meanwhile, in the control classrooms, they changed nothing. The kids just kept playing for fun. And, as the law of effect would predict, the kids receiving the trophies suddenly started spending significantly more time on the math games.
Right, the free pizza effect takes hold.
Yeah, but the crucial phase of the experiment was the withdrawal. A few weeks later, the researchers abruptly stopped giving out the rewards.
Let's cut them off cold turkey.
Cold turkey. No more trophies, no more certificates.
Yeah.
They wanted to measure the residual motivation.
Okay, so what happened?
The children in the control group, the ones who had never been rewarded, they just kept playing the games at their normal baseline level.
Makes sense. Nothing changed for them.
Right. But the experimental group, the kids who had been conditioned to expect a prize, completely abandoned the games.
Right, completely.
Their interest flatlined to near zero.
So by introducing a reward, we didn't just fail to increase their long-term interest. We actively eradicated the natural curiosity that was already there.
Exactly.
What is the cognitive mechanism behind that? Like, why does the brain just discard its own joy?
Well, psychologists call it the overjustification effect.
Overjustification.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it happens when we attempt to understand our own behavior. When a child looks at their own actions and asks, why am I playing this math game? They look for the most salient, obvious reason.
Which would be the trophy.
Right. Before the reward, the brain says, I must be doing this because it's intrinsically fun. But when you introduce a massive, shiny external reward, that external justification drowns out the internal one.
So the kid's brain reevaluates.
Exactly. It says, I am doing this because of the trophy. So the moment the trophy vanishes, the brain's logical conclusion is that there is absolutely no reason to continue the behavior.
Wow. They go overboard in attributing their actions to the situation and just completely discount their own internal disposition.
Yeah, they basically rewrite their own history of why they liked it.
That makes me look at the entire education system differently. I mean, if external rewards act like a corrosive acid on intrinsic motivation, does that mean the concept of grading is fundamentally flawed?
That is a completely natural conclusion to draw.
Are we destroying a college student's love of literature by giving them an A for reading it?
It requires a bit of nuance, actually, which researchers like Tang and Hall brought to light in the mid-90s.
Okay, lay it on me.
There's a massive psychological difference between a task-contingent reward and a performance-contingent reward.
Task contingent versus performance contingent.
Yeah. The pizza for simply reading a book, or the trophy just for playing the math game, that is task-contingent. You get it just for showing up.
Okay.
But a grade is performance-contingent. It depends on how well you did.
So a grade is actually a vehicle for information, not just a bribe.
That's the key distinction. An A on a literature paper tells you that you are highly competent. It provides feedback that you have mastered a complex skill.
And people like feeling competent.
Oh, human beings have a deep intrinsic drive to feel competent. So performance-contingent rewards can actually enhance your interest because they validate your mastery.
So it makes a lot of sense.
However, the danger of overjustification is always lurking. If a student becomes entirely fixated on the GPA as the only reason they are in school, that external pressure will eventually eclipse their love of learning.
It becomes a transaction again.
Exactly. It requires a delicate cognitive balance, reminding yourself that you can desire the high grade and genuinely find the material fascinating.
It's a perfect example of how psychology forces us to look past the surface of everyday behaviors. We think a reward is just a reward, right?
Right.
But beneath the surface, there is this incredibly complex negotiation happening between our environment and our internal sense of self.
Which is fascinating.
And that complexity is really the defining feature of the entire field. When we talk about psychology as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, we are talking about a scope that is almost intimidatingly vast.
It really is.
I mean, it stretches from microscopic cellular misfires to massive sweeping cultural trends.
Yeah, to truly grasp the scale of what psychologists are trying to decode, you kind of have to look at the extremes.
Give me an extreme.
Well, on one end of the spectrum, you have deeply localized, strictly biological phenomena, where a tiny physical alteration entirely rewrites a person's reality.
Okay, the quintessential example of that biological extreme is a condition called prosopagnosia, right?
Yes, or face blindness.
Face blindness. We tend to think of vision and recognition as one holistic system. You open your eyes, you see a person, you know who they are.
It feels instant.
Yeah, but prosopagnosia proves that the brain doesn't work like a camera at all. It works like a highly compartmentalized factory.
It reveals that the brain has highly specialized modules. Prosopagnosia typically results from damage to a very specific area in the right hemisphere of the brain, often the fusiform face area.
Just that one spot.
Just that spot. And what makes this condition so jarring is that the patient's general vision and cognitive abilities remain completely intact.
So they can see fine.
Perfectly fine. They
Yeah.
can read a book, they can recognize a coffee mug, they can navigate a crowded room. But the specific neural pathway designed to synthesize facial features into a recognizable identity is just broken.
That is wild. There is a truly haunting anecdote about this from the text.
Oh, the Oliver Sacks one.
Well, we all know Oliver Sacks wrote about the man who mistook his wife for a hat. But there is another documented case in the text of a man with prosopagnosia sitting in a restaurant.
Oh, right. The mirror incident.
Yes. He becomes increasingly agitated by a stranger across the room who is just staring at him intensely.
Just locking eyes.
Right, and he finally calls the waiter over to complain about the rude stranger, and the waiter has to gently explain to him that he is looking into a mirror.
I mean, it's a profound illustration of how fragile our conscious experience really is.
It's terrifying.
It is, because that man is seeing the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the physical sensory input is perfectly fine. But the cognitive software required to stitch those features together and say, hey, that is me, is offline.
It forces us to realize that something as fundamental as recognizing your own reflection isn't a magical property of consciousness.
No, it is a mechanical output of specific neural wiring.
But the beauty of psychology is that it doesn't just study broken wiring. It studies the universal bugs in the software that every single healthy human brain shares.
Exactly.
Which brings us from the biological extreme to the social extreme. And there's this phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error.
Oh, this is a big one.
Let's play out a scenario for you listening. You are walking through a busy, high-end department store. Up ahead, there is a large crowd gathered, and right in the middle, a charity solicitor has cornered a woman.
Okay, setting the scene.
The solicitor is being incredibly aggressive, loud, and pushy, just demanding a donation in front of everyone. The woman looks deeply uncomfortable, reaches into her purse, and hands over a $20 bill.
Right.
If I ask you, the observer, to explain why she did that, what is your brain's immediate automatic assumption?
Well, the vast majority of people will automatically conclude that she is a generous person. We attribute the behavior to an innate internal personality trait.
Which is absolutely wild.
It is.
Because the situational pressure is blindingly obvious. She is trapped in a social nightmare.
A total nightmare.
99% of us would hand over a 20 just to buy our escape from the awkwardness. So why is our brain entirely blind to the context when we judge her?
It all comes down to where our visual and cognitive attention is anchored.
Explain that.
When you are watching that woman, she is the active, moving figure in your visual field. The crowd and the solicitor are just background noise.
Like she's in the spotlight.
Precisely. Because she is the focal point of your attention, your brain takes a cognitive shortcut and assumes she's the causal agent of her own actions.
So we just blame her personality.
Yeah, we consistently overestimate the impact of personality and vastly underestimate the power of this situation.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we are exposed as massive hypocrites.
Oh, entirely.
Let's reverse the roles. Let's say you are the one trapped in that circle and you hand over the $20. If I pull you aside afterward and ask, wow, why were you so generous?
Right. You would never say, because I am a deeply charitable soul.
Never. You would instantly point to the environment. You'd say, do you see that guy? He was screaming in my face. Everyone was staring. I had literally no other choice.
And that asymmetry is the crux of the error. When we act, we are looking outward. Our eyes are processing the environment, so the situational pressures are the most salient things in our conscious awareness.
So we see the trap.
Exactly. Therefore, we blame the situation for our own actions. But when we look at others, they are the salient object.
Wow.
This cognitive quirk governs almost all of our social judgments. We assume the person who cuts us off in traffic is a fundamentally evil person.
Oh, I do that every day.
We all do. But when we cut someone off, it's because, well, we are late for a critical meeting and the blind spot was tricky.
It's humbling. It really makes you realize how entirely unreliable our snap judgments of character are.
Very much so.
Okay, let's look at another universal bug in the human operating system, one involving time and memory, childhood amnesia.
This one always trips people up.
It's crazy. We go through the most explosive, crucial developmental period of our lives between the ages of 0 and 3. We learn to walk, to speak, to navigate complex emotional landscapes.
It's massive development.
But the archive of that period is completely empty. We remember absolutely nothing.
And to measure just how total this erasure is, researchers use a very specific benchmark from the text: the birth of a younger sibling.
Oh, that's a good benchmark.
It is, because a sibling's birth is a massive, emotional, deeply disruptive event in a toddler's life.
Right.
If your younger sibling was born after you turned 3, you almost certainly retain some fragmented memory of the event, maybe the hospital room or the baby coming home.
Sure, I have vague memories from around then.
But if that sibling was born when you were 2.5, the memory trace is virtually non-existent. It is wiped clean.
It's a total blackout. So why does the brain discard the most foundational years of our lives?
It's a fascinating intersection of biology and cognition.
Okay, break it down.
On the biological side, the brain structures responsible for encoding and consolidating long-term episodic memories, specifically the hippocampus, are simply not fully mature in a toddler.
So the hardware just isn't ready.
Exactly. In fact, the rapid growth of new neurons in the hippocampus during those early years might actually overwrite or disrupt the storage of early memories.
So it's basically under construction, so it can't save the files properly.
Precisely. But there's also a cognitive and linguistic component to it.
Language.
Yeah. As adults, we organize our memories using language. We construct narratives to give our memories structure and meaning.
Like telling a story.
Right. But a 2-year-old does not have the linguistic scaffolding required to build those narratives. Without the vocabulary to file the experience away, the memory simply dissolves. We quite literally do not have the words to remember our own infancy.
That is deeply poetic and honestly slightly terrifying.
It is a bit spooky.
Let's pivot from memory to something highly visible and deeply impactful on a societal level. Obesity.
Okay, let's talk about it.
The variance in obesity rates across different cultures is staggering. You have a country like Japan sitting at an obesity rate of around 3%.
Very low.
The Netherlands is around 10%. But you cross into the UK, and it's a quarter of the adult population, and in the US, it's over a third.
Yeah, and those statistics immediately tell us that obesity cannot be reduced to a simple genetic flaw.
Right, because human genetics simply don't vary that wildly across these populations.
Exactly. While biology dictates how our bodies store fat, psychology is what drives the behaviors that lead to the storage.
And one of the most compelling insights into those behavioral drivers comes from research on deprivation.
The rat starvation study.
This fundamentally changed how I viewed diet culture.
It's a vital piece of research. So scientists took a group of rats and subjected them to severe food deprivation. They were effectively simulating a famine.
Okay.
After a period of starvation, the researchers allowed the rats to eat normally until their body weight returned to a healthy baseline.
So biologically, they were fully recovered.
Completely recovered. Then the researchers took these formerly starved rats, along with a control group of rats that had never missed a meal, and placed them in an environment with unrestricted, unlimited access to food.
And the results were crazy.
Tell them what happened.
The rats with the history of starvation absolutely gorged themselves. They overate massively compared to the control group, even though they weren't currently hungry and had completely recovered their body weight.
Yeah.
It's as if the psychological trauma of the scarcity left a permanent scar on their behavioral software. Their brains were locked in a perpetual state of bracing for the next famine.
And you really have to consider the implications of that mechanism for human beings.
It's huge.
When we look at populations with high obesity rates, we have to look past the individual choice in the moment and look at the history of the environment.
Like what kind of history?
Well, how does a history of food insecurity, poverty, or even the intense self-imposed starvation of extreme yo-yo dieting permanently alter a person's psychological relationship with food?
Ah, so diets can trigger this too.
Absolutely. The brain evolutionarily learns that food is unreliable. So when it is available, the mandate is to consume as much as possible to survive the inevitable future shortage.
Wow. It reframes obesity from a failure of willpower into a highly logical, deeply ingrained survival response to perceived scarcity.
That's exactly it.
Which perfectly illustrates the value of psychological research, right? It takes our assumptions and replaces them with mechanisms.
It does.
And that applies to our final mystery in this scope tour: media violence.
The ultimate dinner table debate.
Truly. Does watching violent movies or playing violent video games actually make children more aggressive? For a long time, the defense relied on this idea called the cathartic effect.
Right, the catharsis theory.
What is that?
It basically posits a hydraulic model of human emotion. It suggests that we all have innate aggressive drives building up inside of us like steam in a kettle.
Okay, I can picture that.
Watching a violent movie, the theory goes, acts as a release valve. The child experiences the violence vicariously, vents the aggression, and is therefore actually less likely to act violently in the real world.
I mean, it sounds incredibly plausible.
It does sound nice. But when psychologists actually ran the numbers, the catharsis theory completely fell apart.
It just wasn't true.
No, it wasn't. The data points in the exact opposite direction. One of the most definitive pieces of evidence from the text is a classic longitudinal study that tracked 430 children.
430 kids. Over how long?
A long time. The researchers measured their exposure to media violence between the ages of 7 and 11. Then they waited. They tracked these exact same individuals down when they were 19 years old to measure their real-world behavior.
And the results were completely unambiguous. For both boys and girls, high exposure to media violence in childhood was strongly correlated with a significantly higher likelihood of engaging in physical aggression like assault or severe fights as young adults.
Yeah, because the brain is not a steam kettle.
Right.
It is an incredibly efficient learning machine. When a child consumes massive amounts of media violence, they aren't venting. They are internalizing a script.
They're taking notes.
Literally. They are learning that aggression is a standard, acceptable, and often rewarded method for resolving conflict.
Wow.
The media provides a cognitive blueprint that they later access when they encounter friction in their own lives.
So we've looked at brain damage, social hypocrisy, infant memory, the trauma of starvation, and the behavioral conditioning of violence.
That's a lot.
The scope of this field is dizzying. But we didn't just wake up in the 21st century with the tools to run longitudinal studies on aggression or map the fusiform face area.
No, definitely not.
Getting to this point required centuries of brutal, paradigm-shifting debates about the fundamental nature of humanity. To understand how we know what we know, we have to look at the historical origins of the science.
And those origins are deeply rooted in the philosophical debates of ancient Greece.
Oh, going way back.
Way back, long before there were laboratories, you had figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle wrestling with the exact same cognitive mysteries we study today.
Like what kind of mysteries?
They were asking questions about consciousness, the illusion of reality, and whether human beings possess free will.
So they were basically the first cognitive psychologists. They just had to rely purely on logic rather than fMRI machines.
Exactly. But parallel to those philosophers, you had Hippocrates.
The father of medicine.
Right. He was intensely focused on the physiology of the brain. He was observing head injuries and deducing that the brain was the control center for the body, laying the very first bricks for the biological perspective.
So you have the abstract mind over here and the physical body over there.
Yes. And this simultaneous focus eventually gave rise to one of the most enduring, contentious debates in intellectual history: nature versus nurture.
A classic.
Are our mental capacities pre-programmed into our biology at birth, or are we entirely the product of our environment and experiences?
So in the 17th century, the battle lines were really drawn.
They were.
Defending the nature corner was the French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes is fascinating because he argued that certain concepts, like the concept of God, the sense of self, and the foundations of mathematics, are entirely innate.
We are born with them.
Right. And he also introduced a deeply mechanistic view of biology.
Which was huge at the time.
Yeah, he viewed the human body as a complex machine made of pipes and valves, which was a radical departure from mystical explanations of life.
And that mechanistic view is actually the distant ancestor of modern information processing theories.
Wow, from pipes to computers.
Basically, yeah. But standing in fierce opposition to Descartes was the English philosopher John Locke, championing the nurture perspective.
Locke is famous for the concept of the tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
The blank slate. He argued that at the exact moment of birth, the human mind contains absolutely nothing, zero innate ideas.
Locke birthed the school of associationist psychology.
Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah. He argued that all human knowledge is derived purely from sensory experience.
So we see, we hear, we touch.
Right. And our mind slowly begins to associate these sensory inputs through similarity and contrast. Like, a child learns that fire is hot because the visual stimulus of the flame is repeatedly associated with the physical sensation of heat.
The implications of the blank slate are massive, especially politically.
Oh, completely.
If we're all born completely blank, then theoretically anyone can become anything if given the right environment.
It's a very democratic idea.
But biologically, we know today that the pure blank slate isn't entirely accurate. So where does modern psychology land on the nature versus nurture debate?
It basically dismisses it as a false dichotomy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the modern consensus is highly integrated. It is never a question of behavior is caused by nature or nurture, but rather how they dynamically interact.
Ah, so it's both.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our biology provides a highly complex, pre-wired foundation, a set of parameters and predispositions. But our environment and experiences leave a permanent, defining mark on how that foundation actually operates in the real world.
Okay, so for centuries, this was the domain of philosophers debating in drawing rooms. When did psychology actually put on a lab coat and become a rigorous science?
The official transition from philosophy to science happened in 1879.
1879.
Yeah, in a small room at the University of Leipzig in Germany. That is where Wilhelm Wundt established the very first psychological laboratory.
Wundt was insanely ambitious.
He was.
He looked at physicists and chemists and thought, if they can isolate the fundamental elements of the physical world, I can isolate the fundamental elements of conscious thought.
It's a bold claim.
Very bold. But how do you capture a thought? You can't put a memory on a scale.
Well, Wundt's solution was a highly regimented method called introspection.
Introspection.
Right. He didn't just ask people how they felt. He rigorously trained subjects to observe and meticulously record their own internal perceptions.
How did that work?
Wundt would introduce a precisely calibrated physical stimulus, like a metronome clicking at a specific speed, or a light of a specific wavelength, and his subjects had to introspect and report the exact elemental sensations they experienced.
So he essentially tried to turn human beings into highly calibrated internal thermometers.
That's a great way to put it.
Tell me the exact milligram of sadness this tone evokes.
Right.
It sounds exhausting and honestly doomed to fail. Everyone's internal thermometer is calibrated differently. My experience of a flashing light is entirely distinct from yours based on 1,000 different biological and historical variables.
And that subjectivity was the fatal flaw of introspection.
It just didn't work.
No matter how rigorously Wundt trained his subjects, the data was just a mess. You cannot build a reliable, objective science on private, unverifiable experiences.
Because if I say one thing and you say another.
Exactly. If two subjects gave completely different introspective reports about the exact same metronome click, there was no objective way to determine who was right.
But despite the failure of the method, Wundt proved that the mind could be subjected to systematic experimentation.
He got the ball rolling.
And that sparked a massive academic land grab, leading to the formation of the first competing theoretical schools, structuralism and functionalism.
Right. So structuralism was brought to America by E.B. Titchener, who was one of Wundt's most devoted students.
Titchener.
Yeah, and Titchener suffered from severe chemistry envy.
Chemistry envy.
Yeah. He believed the ultimate goal of psychology was to discover the mental equivalent of the periodic table.
Oh, wow.
If you drink a sip of hot coffee, a structuralist doesn't care about the cultural experience of a morning routine. They want you to break that sip down into its irreducible mental atoms. The sensation of heat, the bitterness on the tongue, the specific olfactory input.
It's analyzing the bricks and completely ignoring the house.
Precisely.
Which is exactly what drove William James absolutely crazy.
Yes, it did.
James was at Harvard, and he founded the opposing school of functionalism. James was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's recent explosive theory of evolution.
Right.
He thought Titchener's search for static, frozen atoms of thought was utterly useless.
James argued that consciousness isn't a static structure at all. It's a flowing, continuous stream.
Stream of consciousness.
Exactly. And more importantly, taking a cue from Darwin, James asked, well, what is the function of this stream? How do our mental processes actually help human beings adapt, survive, and flourish in a hostile environment?
So the functionalists realized that if you want to understand adaptation, you can't just sit in a dark room analyzing your own taste buds. You have to look at how humans actually behave in the real world.
Right.
But crucially, both the structuralists and the functionalists still fundamentally agreed on one thing. Psychology was the study of the conscious mind.
True. Until the 1920s, when an entirely new movement rose up and just violently rejected everything that came before it.
Sir, behaviorism.
This was the dawn of behaviorism, led by John B. Watson, who basically looked at the messy, subjective squabbling over introspection and said, this is garbage.
He was not a fan.
Not at all. He said, if psychology is ever going to be respected alongside physics and biology, we have to entirely abandon the mind.
Abandon the mind entirely.
Watson's argument was radically simple. Science demands objective measurement. You cannot measure a thought, a desire, or an intent.
Right, they're invisible.
Therefore, the internal workings of the mind are a black box that we should not even attempt to open. The only valid subject matter for psychology is public, verifiable, observable behavior.
The behaviorists, championed later by B.F. Skinner, reduced the entirety of human existence to stimulus and response. SR psychology.
Yep. Yeah.
You touch a hot stove, the stimulus. You pull your hand back, the response. You receive a paycheck, you return to work.
They argued that every complex human trait, our personalities, our fears, our loves, is nothing more than a massive, intricate web of conditioned behaviors forged by environmental rewards and punishments.
I mean, it was an incredibly elegant, mathematically precise, and ultimately very cold view of humanity.
Very cold.
Yeah.
But it was highly effective in a laboratory setting, which allowed behaviorism to utterly dominate American psychology for decades.
But meanwhile, in Europe...
Right. While the Americans were obsessing over observable behavior, German psychologists were taking a completely different approach. In 1912, Max Wertheimer laid the foundation for Gestalt psychology.
Gestalt?
Yeah. The Gestalt school was a direct, targeted attack on the structuralists.
How so?
Well, the structuralists wanted to break everything down into tiny pieces. The Gestalt psychologists argued that the human brain doesn't process reality in pieces. Their defining mantra is vital. The whole is different from the sum of its parts.
The whole is different from the sum of its parts.
Yes, and they prove this through the study of perception.
Give me an example.
If I draw 3 separate, unconnected right angles on a chalkboard, spaced a few inches apart, and ask you what you see, your brain does not register 3 right angles.
I see a rectangle.
Exactly. Your visual cortex automatically and instantly connects the negative space between those angles. You perceive a single, cohesive rectangle.
So your brain imposes structure on the chaos.
It actively constructs meaning where none explicitly exists. And this happens entirely automatically, completely outside of your conscious control.
This was a massive revelation because it proved that human perception is an active, creative process, not just a passive reception of sensory atoms.
Right. It changed the game. Which brings us to the third major alternative to behaviorism, operating simultaneously in Europe.
Psychoanalysis.
Founded by Sigmund Freud.
Ah, Freud!
Yes, Freud. While the behaviorists studied the visible and the Gestaltists studied perception, Freud plunged into the invisible deep.
He introduced the concept of the unconscious mind.
Yes, he did.
He argued that the conscious thoughts we are aware of are just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface is a massive, turbulent reservoir of primitive instincts, hidden traumas, and unacceptable desires.
Freud's hydraulic model suggested that biological drives, particularly those rooted in sexuality and aggression from early childhood, are actively repressed by our civilized conscious mind.
We push them down.
We push them down into the unconscious. But they refuse to stay dead. They generate immense psychological pressure, which eventually forces its way to the surface.
Like steam.
Right, manifesting as neuroses, phobias, dreams, or seemingly accidental slips of the tongue.
Now, obviously, many of Freud's hyper-specific theories about childhood sexuality and psychosexual stages have been heavily criticized or entirely discarded by modern empirical science.
Oh, definitely.
But his core architectural contribution to psychology, the irrefutable reality that human beings are driven by complex motives that operate completely beneath our conscious radar, that remains an absolute bedrock principle of the field.
It does. But despite the brilliance of the Gestaltists and the profound impact of Freud, the rigid, observable science of behaviorism still ruled American universities until a massive paradigm shift occurred in the years following World War II.
We entered the cognitive revolution.
Yes, because the behaviorists had a fatal flaw.
What was it?
They couldn't explain complex human achievements. You cannot explain how a child learns the incredibly complex generative rules of grammar just by pointing to stimulus and response.
Right.
Noam Chomsky tore that behaviorist argument apart in linguistics. The black box of the mind had to be reopened.
But this time, psychologists had a new, highly rigorous vocabulary to describe what was happening inside that box.
The electronic computer.
Yes. In the 1950s, pioneers like Herbert Simon began developing information processing models. Suddenly, the mind wasn't a mystical spirit, it was an organic computer.
And that metaphor changes everything.
It really does. If the brain is a computer, then sensory organs are the input devices, short-term memory is the RAM processing active tasks, and long-term memory is a hard drive storing files for later retrieval.
It allowed scientists to theorize about unobservable mental states with mathematical precision.
Add in Roger Sperry winning a Nobel Prize for mapping specific cognitive functions to specific physical hemispheres of the brain, and the mind was officially back at the center of psychology.
Which brings us directly into the modern era. Because of this rich, chaotic history, contemporary psychologists no longer operate in isolated, warring factions.
Right, you don't really find pure structuralists fighting pure behaviorists anymore.
No, not at all. Instead, the field has synthesized these historical approaches into 5 distinct perspectives. You can think of them as different microscopic lenses.
Okay, lenses.
Depending on which lens you click into place, you see a completely different layer of the exact same human behavior.
Let's put this to a practical test for you listening. Let's take a deeply visceral, single human action and run it through the 5 lenses from the text.
Let's do it.
Imagine you are at a crowded social event. Someone walks up to you and delivers a deeply personal, vicious insult.
Yeah.
Your temper flares, you pull your arm back, and you punch them square in the jaw. One action. A punch. Let's click the first lens into place, the biological perspective.
Okay, looking through the biological lens, the concept of anger or insult is completely irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
Yeah, we are looking purely at the physiological machinery. We are observing the auditory processing of the sound waves, the immediate activation of the amygdala triggering a threat response, the flood of adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream, and the highly coordinated electrical impulses firing down your motor neurons to contract the muscles in your arm and fist.
We're reducing the behavior to its neurobiological mechanics.
Exactly. Very clinical.
Let's switch to lens number 2, the behavioral perspective.
Now, we completely ignore the neurobiology, and we ignore your internal thoughts. We look exclusively at your history of environmental conditioning.
Huh.
The spoken insult is the environmental stimulus. The punch is your conditioned response. A behaviorist would theorize that in your past, perhaps on the playground as a child, responding to verbal aggression with physical violence was somehow rewarded.
Like it stopped the bullying or earned you status.
Right, thereby reinforcing the neural pathway for that specific physical response.
So it's all about past reinforcement.
Yep.
Lens number 3, the cognitive perspective.
Here, we open the information processing black box. You threw the punch because your brain instantly ran a complex computation.
Like a computer.
Yes, you received data, the insult. You retrieved information from your memory about social status and self-worth. And you formulated a specific goal-oriented plan.
What was the goal?
The goal was to neutralize a threat to your social standing. And the computed rational output to achieve that goal was physical retaliation.
Wow. Lens number 4, the psychoanalytic perspective. Back to Freud.
Right. Through this lens, the conscious goal you formulated is an illusion. The insult merely acted as a trigger, weakening your conscious defenses just enough for a repressed, primitive, aggressive instinct to bypass your civilized control and express itself physically.
So maybe an unresolved childhood conflict?
Perhaps stemming from a deeply unresolved conflict with authority or a sibling, You didn't consciously choose to punch them. Your unconscious overpowered you.
And finally, lens number 5, which is perhaps the most defining lens of modern social psychology, the subjectivist perspective.
The subjectivist perspective argues that humans do not react to the objective, physical reality of the world. We react to our constructed, subjective interpretation of the world.
Elaborate on that.
You did not punch that person because of the objective decibel level of their voice. You punched them because your unique cultural background, your current mood, and your personal insecurities caused you to perceive their specific choice of words as an unforgivable attack on your honor. If you had been raised in a different culture, or if you were just in a better mood, you might have perceived the exact same objective words as a clumsy joke and laughed it off.
This lens highlights a cognitive flaw called naive realism, doesn't it?
Yes, naive realism.
It's our stubborn biological conviction that the way we see the world is the absolute objective truth. We constantly forget that our brain is actively filtering and warping reality.
It's so true.
There is a staggering study from 1947 by Brunner and Goodman that proves how deeply our internal desires can warp objective physical reality.
Oh, the coin study. It is a profound demonstration of subjectivism.
Tell them about it.
Researchers gathered a group of 10-year-old children and asked them to manipulate a dial to change the size of a circle of light until it exactly matched the physical size of various coins. Pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters.
A completely objective task, just match the size.
But the results were highly distorted. The children consistently overestimated the physical size of the more valuable coins.
Really?
Yeah. A quarter was perceived as physically much larger than it actually was compared to a penny, purely because it held more psychological value.
But the truly revolutionary finding came when they split the kids by socioeconomic status.
That's the kicker.
The poor children, the kids from households where money was genuinely scarce and highly desired, overestimated the physical size of the valuable coins significantly more than the wealthy children did.
Their subjective desperation for the resource literally reached into their visual cortex and magnified the physical dimensions of the metal in front of their eyes.
They actually hallucinated the size.
Basically.
If the brain is willing to actively hallucinate the physical size of a piece of metal based on our internal needs, imagine how dramatically it warps our perception of a political argument, a romantic conflict, or a perceived insult.
Subjective reality is the only reality that dictates our behavior.
Now, balancing these 5 lenses naturally creates friction, particularly between the biological perspective and the other 4. This friction is known as reductionism.
Right. There is a strong push in some scientific circles to reduce all complex psychological phenomena down to pure biology.
Give me an example.
It's the argument that a mother's love for her newborn isn't a profound emotional state. It's simply a spike in oxytocin binding to specific receptors.
It's the ultimate biological endgame. If every thought we have is ultimately just a chemical reaction and an electrical spark in the brain, Then theoretically, once we fully map the human connectome down to the last synapse, psychology becomes obsolete.
We just hand the keys over to the neurologists.
So let me push back on the entire premise of your profession.
Uh-oh.
Are psychologists just keeping the seat warm? Are you just describing the software until the biologists finally finish reverse engineering the hardware?
Huh. Well, it's a valid challenge, but it fundamentally misunderstands the architecture of science. Psychology is permanently vital for two critical reasons.
Okay, what's the first?
First, psychology is the cartographer for biology.
The map maker.
Exactly. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons forming trillions of connections. It is an incomprehensible forest. If you don't have a map telling you what to look for, you are completely lost.
Psychology provides that map.
It does. For instance, psychological testing proved that human beings process language and spatial reasoning as completely distinct cognitive tasks. That psychological insight is what told biologists to go looking for those distinct functions in different physical hemispheres of the brain.
Ah.
Without the psychological software defining the parameters, the biologist wouldn't know what hardware to look for.
You have to know that a face recognition program exists before you can go looking for the fusiform face area.
Exactly. And the second reason is causality.
Causality.
Biology can explain the mechanism of a behavior, but it often cannot explain the cause. Let's look back at obesity.
Okay.
A biologist can look at your DNA and identify a specific genetic sequence that makes your body incredibly efficient storing calories as fat. But why did that genetic predisposition suddenly trigger rampant obesity in the late 20th century, but not 300 years ago?
The DNA didn't change.
Precisely. The environment changed. It takes a psychologist to look at the macro system, to look at the psychological trauma of poverty, the aggressive behavioral conditioning of fast food marketing, and the societal shifts in sedentary labor.
So biology builds a loaded gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
Exactly. If you reduce everything to biology, you are entirely blind to the environmental triggers that actually dictate our lives.
And realizing that you need both the microbiology and the macro environment is exactly what has driven the evolution of the field in the 21st century.
Right.
Because human behavior is too complex for one perspective, the profession has splintered into dozens of highly specialized subfields. You have clinical psychologists treating pathology, developmental psychologists tracking the lifespan, organizational psychologists trying to fix toxic corporate structures.
But the true cutting edge of the science is happening at the intersections where these fields smash into each other.
Interdisciplinary collaboration.
Yes, that is the defining hallmark of modern psychology. There are four major new frontiers where this synthesis is producing revolutionary insights. The first is cognitive neuroscience.
This is the ultimate alliance between the software and the hardware.
It really is. For decades, cognitive psychologists were hypothesizing about how memory works, drawing flowcharts of short-term and long-term storage, but it was entirely theoretical.
They were essentially working in the dark.
They were. But the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, turned the lights on.
fMRI machines.
Yeah. Now, researchers can place a conscious human being inside a scanner and literally watch the metabolic activity of their brain in real time as they perform cognitive tasks.
And what they found perfectly validated the old theories, didn't it?
It did. When researchers asked a subject in an fMRI machine to hold a piece of information in their short-term memory, like remembering a phone number just long enough to dial it, the scans lit up specifically in the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead.
But when they asked that same subject to recall a long-term episodic memory,
like describing their first day of high school, the metabolic activity shifted entirely. The prefrontal cortex quieted down, and areas deeper in the brain, closer to the hippocampus, lit up.
wow.
Cognitive neuroscience provided visual, irrefutable proof that short-term and long-term memory are not just conceptual ideas. They are distinct, localized physical mechanisms.
Frontier number 2, evolutionary psychology. This field looks at our cognitive software and asks the ultimate biological question: why was this specific program installed in the first place?
Right. They posit that our psychological traits are just like our physical traits. They are genetic adaptations meticulously shaped by millions of years of natural selection.
The foundational premise is that the human brain evolved to solve the specific survival problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors on the Pleistocene savanna.
Exactly. We are walking around a modern world operating on incredibly ancient software.
The classic example of this is our modern dietary disaster.
The sweet tooth.
Yes. Why do human beings have such an overpowering, seemingly irrational craving for sugar and high-fat foods, even when we consciously know it's destroying our health?
Because for 99.9% of human history, calories were scarce and starvation was a constant threat.
So craving sugar was actually good.
In that ancestral environment, the individuals who had a genetic mutation that made them crave the sweetest, most calorie-dense fruits were the ones who built up the fat reserves necessary to survive the winter. They lived, they reproduced, and they passed on that sweet tooth gene.
So my inability to resist a donut isn't a modern moral failing or a lack of willpower.
No, it is a highly tuned, ancient survival mechanism functioning exactly as it was designed to. It's just experiencing a catastrophic mismatch with a modern environment where calories are cheap and unlimited.
This perspective is so powerful because it takes behaviors we view as dysfunctions and reframes them as ancient tactics for survival.
Which leads us to the third frontier, cultural psychology.
What does that challenge?
It challenges one of the most arrogant assumptions in the history of the field. For most of its history, academic psychology was conducted almost exclusively by Western researchers studying Western university students.
Right.
And they operated under the assumption that the fundamental mechanics of the human mind were universal.
They assumed a brain in Chicago processes reality exactly the same way as a brain in Tokyo or Nairobi.
Exactly. Cultural psychology has aggressively proven that assumption false. The culture you are embedded in from birth doesn't just dictate the language you speak or the clothes you wear. It fundamentally rewires your cognitive representations of reality.
And the major fault line they study is the difference between Western cultures like the US and Western Europe and Eastern cultures like Japan, China, and Korea.
Right. Western culture is deeply individualistic. We view the self as an autonomous, independent agent carving their own path. Eastern cultures are generally highly interdependent. The self is defined primarily by its relationships and obligations to the social group.
And that profound cultural difference changes how people physically view the world.
It really does. Let's look back at the fundamental attribution error.
The tendency to blame personality and ignore the situation.
Cultural psychologists discovered that this error is largely a Western phenomenon.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When an individual from a highly interdependent Eastern culture observes someone's behavior, their brain is culturally conditioned to scan the entire social context. They are significantly more likely to attribute the behavior to situational pressures than a Westerner is.
The impact of this in real life is massive. Let's look at education. If an American student is consistently failing a math class, what happens?
The deeply ingrained Western reflex is to blame the individual's innate traits. The teacher, the parents, and even the student will conclude, well, he just isn't a math person. He doesn't have the aptitude.
But in a Japanese educational setting,
the causality is inverted. If a student is struggling, the cultural reflex is to look at the situation and the process. The teacher and the parents will assess the instructional methods, the social dynamics of the classroom, and the sheer volume of effort the student is applying.
the difference in outcomes there is staggering.
It is. If you blame an innate trait, the problem is fixed and unchangeable. The student gives up.
But if you blame a situation and the effort, the problem is entirely solvable.
Exactly. Cultural psychology proves that culture is a lens that literally alters our cognitive reality.
And if cultural psychology alters our cognition, our final frontier alters our very biology. Behavioral epigenetics.
This is the mind-bending one.
For a long time, the central dogma of biology was that your DNA was a static blueprint. You inherited a specific sequence of genes at birth, and that sequence rigidly dictated your biological destiny.
The blueprint was carved in stone.
But epigenetics completely shattered that idea, introducing the concept of extreme biological plasticity. Our lived experiences can actually reach down and alter our physical biology. We see this in two distinct ways, right?
Yes, neuroplasticity and phenotypic plasticity.
Break down neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to constantly rewire its own physical architecture. Every time you learn a new skill, navigate a new city, or form a powerful memory, you aren't just uploading data to a static hard drive.
You're changing the brain.
You are literally growing new dendrites and strengthening specific synaptic connections. The physical shape of your neural network is in a constant state of flux based on your daily experiences.
But phenotypic plasticity is where it gets truly wild. This is the discovery that environmental factors can actually change how your genes are expressed.
Right. Imagine your DNA is a massive soundboard in a recording studio.
Okay, a soundboard.
The genetic sequence you inherit dictates which sliders exist on the board. You can't add or remove sliders.
Right, you're stuck with those genes.
But epigenetics is the discovery that your environment, your stress levels, and your diet act as the sound engineer.
Oh.
The environment can reach out and push a specific genetic slider up, turning a gene's expression on full blast, or push it all the way down, silencing it completely, often by attaching chemical tags like methyl groups directly to the DNA.
The implications for psychological stress are terrifying.
They really are.
We have always known that chronic stress triggers the release of cortisol. But behavioral epigenetics revealed that this cortisol isn't just floating around causing tension, it physically interacts with your cellular biology.
High levels of stress-induced cortisol can literally alter the epigenetic expression of the genes controlling your immune system.
So your psychological distress at work is actively communicating with your DNA, turning down the volume on your immune response, leaving you physically vulnerable to illness.
The mind and the body are not separate entities. They are locked in a continuous dynamic conversation down to the molecular level.
Which is incredibly heavy. But it brings us to a massive structural question. We've spent this entire time talking about astounding discoveries, the overjustification effect, the fundamental attribution error, neuroplasticity, cultural rewiring.
Right.
But how do we actually know any of this is true? How do psychologists separate a brilliant theory from a biological fact?
This takes us into the engine room of the profession, the methods of psychology.
Okay, let's talk methods.
The bedrock of all psychological knowledge is the scientific method. It always begins with a theory, which is a broad, integrated set of principles designed to explain a phenomenon.
But a theory is useless unless it generates a hypothesis.
Exactly. A highly specific, testable prediction.
Let's ground this. We have the theory of the overjustification effect. External rewards destroy intrinsic motivation.
Okay.
The testable hypothesis is, if I introduce a trophy for playing a math game, the children will stop playing the game when the trophy is removed. So how do we scientifically prove that hypothesis?
The gold standard of scientific proof is the controlled experiment. It is the only method capable of definitively proving cause and effect because the investigator actively manipulates the environment.
And every true experiment hinges on the relationship between variables.
Yes.
The anatomy of an experiment always involves an independent variable and a dependent variable.
Right. The independent variable is the hypothesized cause. It is the one element of the universe that the experimenter holds absolute control over and actively manipulates.
So in the math game study, the independent variable is the presence or absence of the trophy.
Yes. One group gets the reward, the other group gets nothing.
The group getting nothing is the baseline, the control.
And the dependent variable is the hypothesized effect. It is the outcome you measure at the very end of the study.
In this case, the dependent variable is the amount of time the children spend playing the math game after the rewards are withdrawn.
The outcome depends on the manipulation of the independent variable.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough.
Yeah.
But here's where my brain always trips up when designing an experiment.
Where's that?
If I am running this study, why can't I just walk into the classroom and ask for volunteers? Hey kids, who wants to be in the group that plays for trophies, and who wants to be in the group that just plays for fun?
Let them self-select.
Yeah, let them choose. It's easier, and everyone is happy.
If you do that, you have completely destroyed the scientific validity of your experiment.
Destroyed it.
Completely. You have introduced a catastrophic flaw known as an experimental confound.
Walk me through exactly why that ruins the data.
Imagine you live the kids' shoes. The highly competitive, externally driven, hyperactive children are all going to stampede into the trophy group.
True.
The relaxed, internally motivated, quieter children might opt for the fun group. Now you run the experiment. At the end, you measure the time spent playing, and you find a massive difference between the two groups.
Okay.
What caused the difference? Was it the trophy? Or was it the fact that the trophy group was entirely populated by hyper-competitive kids?
You have no idea.
You have no idea. You are no longer measuring the effect of a reward. You are measuring a pre-existing personality difference.
The waters are totally muddied.
This is why random assignment is the most crucial, magical ingredient in any experimental design. Every single participant must have an equal, mathematically randomized chance of being placed in either the experimental group or the control group.
You flip a coin.
You flip a coin.
Because if you rely purely on chance, the laws of probability dictate that the hyper-competitive kids, the sleeky kids, the math geniuses, and the kids who hate school will be perfectly evenly distributed across both groups.
Exactly. Random assignment washes out the noise of individual differences. It ensures that the only significant difference between the two groups is the independent variable, the trophy.
Therefore, if a behavioral difference emerges at the end, you can definitively state that the trophy caused it.
That's the power of the experiment.
But the reality of human research is that we cannot experiment on everything.
We really can't.
We cannot randomly assign one group of teenagers to suffer severe emotional abuse and another group to be nurtured just to measure the long-term effects on their amygdala. It's morally abhorrent.
It is.
So when experiments are impossible, how do we measure reality?
We rely heavily on the correlational method. This is where the researcher does not manipulate anything. They simply observe two naturally occurring variables in the wild to see if they move together in a predictable pattern.
And we quantify this relationship using a statistic called the correlation coefficient.
Right, symbolized by the letter R, which ranges from a perfect negative 1.0 to a perfect positive 1.0.
Let's make this concrete using the prosopagnosia face blindness data from the text.
Okay. If you look at the neurological data plotting face recognition errors against the severity of brain damage, you see a very clear pattern.
What's the pattern?
On a scatter plot, as you move along the x-axis, meaning more severe brain damage, the data points on the y-axis, the number of errors, move upward. The line angles up from left to right.
So that's a positive correlation.
A strong positive correlation, around plus 0.90. As one variable increases, the other variable increases in tandem.
Now, what if we change the y-axis? Instead of plotting errors, we plot the number of correct facial identifications.
Now the geometry inverts. As brain damage increases on the x-axis, the number of correct identifications on the y-axis plunges downward.
The line angles from top left to bottom right.
This is a negative correlation of negative 0.90. It is an equally strong, highly predictable relationship, but the variables move in completely opposite directions.
And if we plot face recognition errors against the patient's shoe size,
you get a random cloud of dots, no line, no pattern, no predictability. That is a zero correlation. The two variables have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Okay, so correlations allow us to predict behavior. If I know the extent of your brain damage, I can highly predict your error rate. But there is a massive neon warning label attached to this method.
The golden rule. Correlation does not imply causation.
Say it again for the people in the back.
Just because two variables move together in perfect harmony does not mean that variable A is causing variable B.
This brings us right back to the media violence debate. Longitudinal studies show a strong positive correlation. Teenagers who watch massive amounts of violent media are highly correlated with committing acts of physical aggression.
Right.
Can we say the movies caused the violence based on that?
No, because of the directionality problem.
The directionality problem.
Does watching violent movies cause a child to become aggressive? Or do naturally aggressive children instinctively seek out violent media that matches their internal state?
It's a chicken and egg scenario.
Or, even more dangerously, you have the third variable problem.
The invisible puppet master.
Yes. There could be a third unmeasured variable causing both A and B.
And there's a classic historical example of weaponizing the third variable problem.
Oh, yeah. The defense strategy of the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century.
Tell them about this. It's wild.
The medical correlation was undeniable. Smoking rates and lung cancer rates moved together in near-perfect lockstep. But the tobacco lawyers argued, hey, correlation isn't causation.
Which is technically true.
It is technically true. They argued, what if people who live in highly industrialized, polluted cities are both more likely to smoke and more likely to get cancer from the smog? The smog is the third variable causing both.
Statistically, without a controlled experiment, you couldn't technically disprove their argument. It was a brilliant, highly lethal manipulation of scientific methodology.
Though obviously, later controlled experiments on animal models definitively proved the direct causal link between tobacco and cancer.
Right, right. What other tools do psychologists have besides experiments and correlations?
When you are venturing into completely uncharted territory, you often rely on direct observation. In the 1960s, William Masters and Virginia Johnson wanted to understand the physiology of human sexuality. They couldn't rely on asking people questions, because people are notoriously unreliable narrators of their own intimate lives. They had to directly observe and record the physiological changes in a laboratory setting to establish the baseline biological facts.
Which highlights the massive flaw in the survey method.
Surveys are incredibly efficient. Alfred Kinsey used surveys to gather data on the sexual behaviors of thousands of Americans in a matter of months.
But there's a catch.
Surveys are deeply vulnerable to social desirability bias. When you hand someone a questionnaire, they consciously and unconsciously alter their answers to make themselves look closer to the societal ideal.
They lie.
They report exercising more, eating better, and being more charitable than they actually are.
You also have case histories, which are incredibly deep, multi-year dives into a single individual's life, usually gathered during clinical therapy.
Right. They are fantastic for generating new hypotheses, but they are terrible for proving them, largely because human memory is so deeply flawed and subjective.
And finally, when you have 100 different studies on a topic that all contradict each other, what do?
You utilize a meta-analysis. This is a massive statistical technique where a researcher gathers the raw data from dozens or even hundreds of independent studies on a single topic.
So they just smash it all together.
They combine all of that disparate data into one giant, overarching statistical model. It's a way to wash out the noise of flawed individual studies and reveal the undeniable overarching truth hidden in the sheer volume of data.
Now, setting up these experiments, surveying thousands of people, putting subjects in fMRI machines, none of this happens in a vacuum. It is heavily governed by strict ethical guidelines.
The history of psychology contains some incredibly dark chapters regarding the treatment of human subjects, and that led to the establishment of institutional review boards.
Today, human research is governed by 3 non-negotiable principles. First, minimal risk.
Right. The physical and psychological stress encountered in an experiment cannot exceed the stress a person would normally encounter in their daily life.
Second, right to privacy. All personal data must be strictly confidential, often coded and decoupled from the subject's identity.
Yep.
And the third is informed consent. Before an experiment begins, you must explicitly tell the participant what the study entails, what the risks are, and that they have the absolute right to stand up and walk out at any moment without penalty.
That is crucial.
But hold on, I see a massive structural problem here.
Which is?
If I have to tell a subject exactly what I am testing, aren't I ruining the experiment?
How so?
Going back to our earlier scenario, if I want to measure the physiological response to anger, and I hand a subject a form that says, in 10 minutes, an actor is going to come in and viciously insult you to make you angry. The subject isn't going to experience genuine anger. They're going to sit there, brace themselves, and critically evaluate the actor's performance. How can you possibly study authentic human emotion if you have to announce it first?
You have hit on one of the most difficult tensions in psychological methodology. How do you maintain ethical transparency while preserving the element of surprise required for authentic behavior?
Right.
The ethical guidelines do permit the use of deception, but only under intensely scrutinized conditions.
So you can lie to them.
You can obscure the true nature of the study, provided you can prove to an ethics board that the deception is absolutely vital to the scientific integrity of the research and that no other method is possible.
Okay.
But the most critical caveat is the requirement of a thorough debriefing. The absolute minute the experiment concludes, the researcher is legally and ethically bound to sit the subject down, pull back the curtain, and explain the deception.
So they have to say, the person who insulted you was an actor. We were measuring your heart rate. Here is why we had to do it this way.
Exactly. The researcher is responsible for repairing any emotional distress and ensuring the subject leaves the laboratory with their dignity entirely intact.
That makes sense. It's a highly monitored compromise. And what about animal research? We talked about the rat deprivation study earlier.
Animal models are actually used in a minority of psychological research, roughly 7%, primarily utilizing rodents and birds.
Okay, so not that much.
No. And the ethical guidelines here focus on necessity and humane treatment. Any procedure involving pain, deprivation, or stress must be overwhelmingly justified by the potential scientific or medical knowledge to be gained. The housing, feeding, and veterinary care of the animals are strictly regulated.
It is a massive, highly regulated apparatus designed to systematically extract truth from the chaos of behavior.
It definitely is.
So we have covered the dizzying scope of the field, traced its history from Greek philosophers to fMRI machines, examined the 5 competing lenses of modern theory, and broken down the scientific methods used to prove them.
We've covered a lot.
Let's take all of this heavy machinery and apply it to a massive, age-old philosophical debate from the text. We are going to look at human nature through the evolutionary and biological lenses. The central question is, are human beings naturally biologically selfish?
And it is crucial to state clearly here for everyone listening, We are going to impartially map out the arguments of two preeminent scientists who sit on opposite sides of this debate.
Right. We are not taking sides.
We are not endorsing one view over the other. We are simply observing how different applications of evolutionary theory lead to radically different conclusions about human morality.
Perfect. So in the yes, we are fundamentally selfish corner, we have the late evolutionary biologist George C. Williams. His argument is incredibly stark and rests entirely on the concept of the selfish gene.
Williams argued that the only reason any biological trait or behavioral instinct exists today is because at some point in ancestral history, it was ruthlessly efficient at ensuring the survival and replication of its underlying DNA. Therefore, organisms, including human beings, are essentially just temporary disposable survival machines built by selfish genes for the sole purpose of self-propagation.
It's a very cynical view of life. But immediately, a massive counter-argument springs to mind.
What is it?
If we are just ruthless survival machines, why do human beings do incredibly selfless things all the time? A parent will literally sacrifice their own life, starving themselves so their child can eat. How does Williams explain extreme parental sacrifice through the lens of selfishness?
He explains it through a biological mechanism called kin selection.
Kin selection.
From the cold mathematical perspective of a gene, a child contains 50% of the parent's genetic code.
Right.
Therefore, a parent sacrificing their resources or even their life for a child is not an act of pure transcendent altruism. It is simply the gene executing a calculated strategy to ensure its own survival in the next generation.
Oh, wow.
We're evolutionarily programmed to exhibit intense favoritism toward our genetic relatives and to be deeply suspicious of strangers who do not share our DNA.
And Williams backs this up by pointing to some incredibly brutal behaviors in the animal kingdom. Take male birds, for instance. A male bird will spend an astonishing amount of energy aggressively guarding his mate, essentially trapping her to prevent any possibility of cuckoldry.
Because the evolutionary math is unforgiving. If another male fertilizes the eggs, the first male will spend an entire season exhausting himself gathering food to raise nestlings that contain 0% of his DNA.
It is a catastrophic genetic failure.
So the intense mate guarding is a purely selfish adaptation to protect his genetic investment.
And Williams takes this dark premise and applies it directly to human culture. He argues that human beings take this underlying biological selfishness and weaponize it through our unique capacity for language.
Right, we use words to manipulate each other's evolutionary programming.
A classic example is military rhetoric. Why do generals and politicians constantly use familial terms to describe an army?
Ah, like brothers in arms.
Right. Shakespeare's Henry V, standing before his troops, calling them a band of brothers, he wasn't related to a single one of them.
No, he wasn't.
But by using the language of kinship, he was actively hacking into their biological kin selection instincts. He was tricking their evolutionary software into fighting and dying for strangers by making them feel like family.
Under Williams's view, almost all human morality and heroism is just a deeply complex, socially manipulated expression of genetic selfishness.
It is a highly cohesive, internally logical argument. But standing in fierce opposition to Williams is the primatologist Frans de Waal. He represents the no, we are not naturally selfish perspective.
De Waal acknowledges the mechanics of evolution, but he violently rejects the conclusion that every modern human action is driven by a selfish motive.
Because de Waal points to undeniable acts of profound empathy that offer absolutely zero genetic payoff.
He does. He points to Lenny Skutnik.
Right, Lenny Skutnik, the bystander who watched a plane crash into the freezing Potomac River, stripped off his coat and dove into the ice to drag a completely unrelated stranger to safety at massive risk to his own life.
Or Binti Wa, the gorilla at the Brookfield Zoo.
That's a great example.
She gently picked up a human toddler who had fallen into her enclosure and cradled him until help arrived. There is no shared DNA. There is no kin selection. It is pure, unadulterated empathy.
So how does he explain that?
De Waal argues that biologists like Williams make a catastrophic theoretical error. They confuse an evolutionary function with a psychological motive.
Function versus motive. This distinction is brilliant.
Walk us through it.
Think about a spider spinning a web. What is the evolutionary function of the web? It is a highly engineered trap to catch flies so the spider can extract calories, survive, and pass on its genes.
That is the ultimate biological function.
And you could somehow interview the spider while it's spinning. Does the spider actually know any of that?
Of course not. The spider has no concept of Darwinian fitness or future calories.
The spider's immediate psychological motive is simply a blind internal urge. It just feels an overwhelming instinct to arrange the silk in a certain pattern.
The function is survival. The motive is just doing what feels right in the moment.
Exactly. And de Waal applies this directly to human empathy. He points out that even Adam Smith, the philosophical architect of ruthless, self-interested capitalism, and Charles Darwin himself, both strongly argued that human beings possess a profound universal capacity for genuine sympathy.
So how does de Waal explain the evolution of that sympathy, if it isn't just kin selection?
Well, he theorizes that the impulse for empathy originally evolved in small, tight-knit ancestral groups where everyone was either a relative or a lifelong reciprocator.
In that environment, the biological function of helping a neighbor was that the neighbor would survive to help you later. It was a survival strategy.
But over millions of years, the psychological motive, the immediate visceral feeling of empathy, became generalized.
The software outgrew the hardware's original intent.
So today, when we see a stranger drowning in an icy river, we don't run a genetic calculus. We just feel a powerful, immediate psychological motive to help, even though the original evolutionary context, expecting a favor in return, is completely absent. We just want to alleviate their suffering.
De Waal argues that we have evolved into genuinely moral creatures. The capacity for selfless empathy is just as naturally, biologically ingrained in us as the capacity for selfishness.
It proves that when you combine the biological perspective with the cognitive perspective, human behavior defies simple reductionist explanations.
It is a stunning debate, and it really showcases the ultimate power of this entire field of study.
We've covered a staggering amount of intellectual ground today. We started with the philosophy of the blank slate, moved through Wundt's grueling introspection laboratory, survived the mechanical worldview of the behaviorists, and ended up peering into the digital readouts of modern fMRI machines and decoding the molecular impacts of behavioral epigenetics.
We've explored the mechanics of why external rewards can destroy internal passion, why toddlers cannot encode long-term memories, and why we are so incredibly quick to judge the character of a charity donor while instantly excusing our own identical behavior.
It fundamentally changes how you view yourself.
It does.
If there is one practical daily application from this massive deep dive, I think it circles back to the subjectivist perspective and the fundamental attribution error.
Oh, for sure.
Once you truly internalize the scientific fact that your brain is actively, constantly constructing your reality, and that you have a hardwired biological bias to blame other people's character while making excuses for your own circumstances, you gain a superpower.
You gain the ability to hit pause in your daily life. You can recognize your brain's flawed programming, step back, and give other people and yourself a little bit more grace.
It allows you to move through the world with curiosity rather than immediate judgment.
That is deeply true.
And it brings me to a final lingering thought that synthesizes two of the most powerful concepts we unpacked today. We talked extensively about behavioral epigenetics, the irrefutable biological reality that our environment, and specifically our psychological stress levels, can literally reach into our cellular structure and alter how our DNA is expressed.
Our biology is highly plastic and responsive to our internal state.
Yes. And we also talk heavily about the subjectivist perspective, the fact that our internal state and our perception of reality are entirely dictated by how we choose to interpret events, not just the objective physical facts of the world.
The world is what we perceive it to be.
So if our physical epigenetic biology changes based on our stress levels, and our stress levels are generated entirely by our subjective, constructed perception of reality, does that mean the way you actively choose to perceive and frame a stressful situation today could actually physically alter the genetic legacy you leave for tomorrow? Think about that the next time you get cut off in traffic. Thanks for taking this incredible deep dive with us today. Until next time, keep questioning the invisible machinery of your own mind.